Hello, and welcome to Book Circle. I'm Earl Weinberg. This time we will continue our reading of Tyler's Row by Miss Reed. The 4 cottages on Tyler's Row are up for sale, and the Hales are thinking of buying them. As it happened, the Hales did not visit Fairacre until the following week, for end of term was upon them, involving a sports day, a tennis tournament arranged by the Hardworking Parents Association to raise funds for the school's swimming pool, a dinner for 3 of the staff who were retiring, as well as the usual end-of-term chores such as reports, last-minute advice to panicking school leavers looking for jobs, and so on. "Well," said Peter Hale, arriving home on the last day of term with a broad smile, "now we've broken up and my peptic ulcers can recover gently." He popped into the settee, put up his feet, and surveyed the ceiling blissfully. "Think of it, 7 weeks of freedom, time to do just as we like." "If you still want to look at that place at Fairacre, perhaps we could drive out tomorrow," suggested Diana. "Tomorrow, the day after that, any day you like, my dear. I'm a free man," declared Peter rapturously. "If we leave it too long," pointed out his wife, "it will have been snapped up." "So it might," agreed her husband, coming abruptly to earth. "Let's go tomorrow morning." It was a perfect day to drive the 6 miles northward to Fairacre. They picked up the key as they drove through Caxley and were soon out of the town, driving through leafy lanes and rising steadily as they approached the downs. The sky was cloudless and a blue haze shimmered over the wide fields. Honeysuckle and a few late wild roses embroidered the hedges, and when Peter stopped the car to fill his pipe, Diana heard a lark scattering its song from the sky. A blue butterfly, native of the chalk country, hovered over the purple knapweed on the bank. Nearby was a patch of yellow and cream toadflax, vivid in the sunshine, and everywhere was the scent of warm grass and leaves, the very essence of summertime. "Wonderful country," said Peter dreamily, gazing into the blue distance above the leaping match flame. "In this weather," replied Diana, "could be pretty bleak in the winter, and lonely." "You don't sound very enthusiastic," said Peter, turning to look at her. "Shall we go back?" "Not till we've seen Tyler's Row," Diana said firmly. "We'll know what to think then." Peter started the engine, and they made their way slowly through Beech Green and on to Fairacre without speaking further until they reached the post office in the center of the village street. As it happened, Mr. Lamb, the postmaster, was in his front garden cutting back rose-suckers with a fierce-looking clasp knife. "Tyler's Row?" called Peter, winding down the car window. "Eh?" said Mr. Lamb, startled. "Tyler's Row, Mr. Bennet's property," enlarged Peter, knowing that it is far better to name the owner than the house in rural parts. John Lamb, who had not heard Peter properly at first, was a trifle nettled at having Bennet's name brought in. He was postmaster, wasn't he? He knew Tyler's Row well enough, after all these years, without some foreigner trying to tell him his business. He answered rather shortly, "On your left, matter of 100 yards or so. You'll see the thatch over the hedge-top." "Thanks very much," said Peter equally shortly. Diana turned her gentle smile upon John Lamb to soften her husband's brusqueness. "Surly sort of devil," commented Peter, eyes alert to the left. "I thought he looked rather a dear," said Diana. "Look, that's it." They pulled up by the tall hawthorn hedge. "That archway's rather attractive," said Diana. "Shall we go in?" The gate was rickety and dragged on the ground. A semicircle had been worn into the earth, and the pressure had caused some of the palings to hang loose. "Tut, tut," clicked Peter, who was a tidy man. "Only the hinge gone. Would have taken 5 minutes to replace." They stood just inside the gate and surveyed Tyler's Row. The cottage nearest them had a fine yellow rose climbing over it. The dark foliage glittered in the sunshine as brightly as holly leaves. The windows were closely shut, despite the heat of the day, and Diana was positive she saw a curtain twitch as though someone were watching them. They moved a few steps along the brick path. A bumblebee wandered lazily from rose to rose, his humming adding to the general air of languor. The two empty cottages, their windows blank and curtainless, looked forlorn and unloved. The paint peeled from the doors and window frames, and a long skinny branch of japonica blew gently back and forth in the light breeze, scraping across the glass of an upstairs window with an irritating, squeaking noise. "Turns your teeth to chalk, doesn't it?" remarked Peter, "like catching your fingernail on the blackboard." "Or wearing those crunchy nylon gloves," added Diana. "I've been spared that," said Peter, stepping forward and pressing his face to the glass. At that moment, a woman came out of the last cottage, flung a bucket of water across the garden bed in a flashing arc, and stood, hand on hip, surveying the couple. Her face was grim, her eyes unwelcoming. "Can I help?" she asked tartly. It looked as though it were the last thing she wanted to do. But Diana answered her softly. "No, thank you. We'll try not to bother you. We have the key to look at these cottages." At the same moment, the door of the other occupied cottage opened, and out stepped Sergeant Burnaby. His face was as yellow as his roses, but his bearing was still soldierly. "Yes, sir," he said briskly. "Anything I can do to help, sir?" "No, thanks," said Peter with a smile. "Just taking a look at the property." "In a very poor way, sir, very poor way indeed. My old friend Jim Bennett hasn't the wherewithal to keep it together. No discredit to him. Just circumstances, you understand. A fine man he was, sir. We served together for—" A violent snort from the woman at the end interrupted the old soldier's monologue, and Peter Hale took the opportunity of turning the key in the lock and opening the door of one of the cottages. "We mustn't keep you," he said firmly, and ushering Diane inside, he closed the door upon the two remaining tenants of Tyler's Row. Despite the summer heat which throbbed over the garden, the cottage interior was cold and damp. This was the Waits' old home, and had been empty now for a long time. Cobwebs draped the windows, and a finger of ivy had crept inside and was feeling its way up the crack of the door. Diana could smell the bruised aromatic scent where the opening door had crushed it. The floor was of uneven bricks, and snails had left their silver trails across it. The old-fashioned kitchen range was mottled with rust, and some soot had spattered from the chimney to the hearth. But the room was unusually large, with a window back and front, and there were several fine oak beams across the low ceiling. There were two more doors. One opened upon a narrow staircase, and the other led to a smaller room. Above stairs were two fair-sized bedrooms, and the view at the back of the cottage was breathtaking. Mile upon mile, it seemed, of cornfields, just beginning to be tinged with gold, stretched away to the summit of the downs. A hawk hovered nearby, a motionless speck in the clear blue, and from everywhere, it seemed to Diana, came the sound of larks singing. She forced open one of the creaking windows, and the sweet air lifted her hair. Peter came behind her, and they gazed together in silence. Immediately below them lay the four long, narrow gardens. Sergeant Burnaby's had a row of runner beans growing in it, and a strip of bright annuals, poppies, cornflowers, marigolds, and nasturtiums, growing higgledy-piggledy together near the back door. A ramshackle run containing half a dozen hens and a splendid cockerel completed Sergeant Burnaby's garden, with the exception of a stout wooden armchair, much weather-beaten, that stood on the flagstones in the shelter of the house. Mrs. Fowler's garden had a concrete windmill, two stone ducks, a frog twice as large as the ducks, and a neat rose bed planted with a dozen standard roses. Beyond this stretched the kitchen garden, ruled neatly into rows of onions, beetroot, parsnips, carrots, and a positive sea of flourishing potato plants. clothesline near the house bore a row of fiercely white tea towels and pillowcases, which, Diana guessed correctly, had been bleached to within an inch of their lives. Between the two gardens lay the wide, neglected area of grass, docks, and nettles which Diana had envisioned. There seemed to be a square of fruit bushes, almost shrouded in weeds toward the end of one garden, and the rustic arch leaned like the Tower of Pisa halfway down the other. It was a sad scene of desolation, but for some reason it did not depress Diana. Her gardener's heart was touched at the sight of so much neglect, but unaccountably she wanted to shout from the window to the beleaguered plants, telling them to hang on, to cling to life, that help was coming, that she would save them. She was surprised and slightly amused at the vehemence of the feeling which shook her. She was becoming bewitched. Peter was now stamping on the ancient floorboards, which stood up to this onslaught sturdily. His eyes scrutinized the beams for wormwood, his fingernails peeled a little of the damp wallpaper, and he sniffed the air like a pointer for any trace of dry rot. They went down the squeaking stairs and into the next cottage. It was a replica of the first, with another large room adjoining a small one and 2 bedrooms above, but the staircase here was broken and dangerously splintered, and the dampness, if anything, more noticeable. "What do you think?" asked Diana. "Huh," grunted her husband enigmatically. "Do you want to look at the other two? I suppose we can." "Not now. I've seen enough, I think. Let's go back and think about it." There was no sign of Mrs. Fowler or Sergeant Burnaby as they closed and locked the doors, but martial music was issuing loudly from the latter's radio set and competed with the humming of hundreds of insects enjoying the downland sunshine. They closed the broken gate carefully and looked through the archway at the scene which had fascinated so many sightseers before them. "It would never do, of course," said Diana at last, "although it's a heavenly spot." Her voice trailed away. Despite her words, she had the odd feeling that the forlorn cottages and the smothered garden were beseeching her for help. Could she withstand that piteous cry? "I need my tea," she said forcefully, turning her back upon Tyler's Row. She made her way, almost in panic it seemed, to her surprised husband, back to the haven of the car. Chapter 3. Local Competitors. The Hales, of course, were not the only people to visit Tyler's Row, and as the village watched the callers, speculation grew animated. "One chap came from Lincolnshire," said Mr. Willett, "said he knew these parts from the fishin' and might retire here. I met him outside the Beetle. Very civil-spoken he was, too, coming from so far away." Mr. Willett spoke as though this were extremely odd, as if Lincolnshire people might be expected to have their heads growing from their breasts, like the natives described by medieval travelers in distant lands. But most of the visitors came from Caxley or neighboring villages. One, indeed, came from Fairacre itself, and he was Henry Maughan. Henry Maughan and his wife have lived in Fairacre for some time. He is a renowned ornithologist, but better known in our village as a zealous churchwarden and parish councillor. He and his wife occupy part of a fine Queen Anne house at the end of the village. Why should he want to move? "Find him them stairs too much, I don't doubt," said one. "Needs more room for all them books and papers of his," said another. "Wants his own home, I expect," said a third, who wants to die in a rented place. As it happened, all 3 reasons had something to do with Mr. Maughan's interest in Tyler's Row. Both he and his wife had twinges of arthritis, and the idea of making a home on the ground floor appealed to them. Then their present abode was some distance from the hub of the village. The post office, the shops, the church, and the bus stop were close to Tyler's Row. And his books grew more numerous as the years passed, and despite his wife's threats to throw them out, Henry Maughan refused to part with a single volume. At least one room downstairs could be set aside as a library cum office, and the lesser-used books could be housed elsewhere. And then Tyler's Row had always attracted him. The long thatched roof, silvery with age, its southern-facing aspect making it bask like a cat in the sunshine, its thick hawthorn hedge screening it from the road, had all combined to delight Henry Maughan whenever he passed the property. His wife was less kindly disposed. A forthright woman who had upset many a Fairacre worthy with her bluntness, she told her husband just what she thought of the project. "Nothing but a hovel, and those two old people a positive menace. There's nothing wrong with this present place, except the stairs and your books. We can still manage the first, and if you would only weed out the second, we should be perfectly happy." Henry Maughan doubted this privately, but had the sense to hold his tongue. He dropped the argument for the time being, but returned to it several times in the next few days, for it was a matter which obsessed him. His wife remained adamant, but was beginning to realize she was up against unusually stubborn opposition. Henry Maughan had been back and forth to the estate's agent and to Tyler's Row, and had even gone so far as to get the place surveyed. "You see, my dear," he told his wife, "this might be an investment. It is ridiculously cheap because of the tenants and the dilapidation. I know we should have to spend a lot on it, but we've enough behind us to cope with it. We could make a start on the empty pair, making them one, and let it when it was done until we felt we wanted to move in ourselves." "You mean stay here indefinitely?" asked his wife suspiciously. "I don't see why not. We should be on the spot for watching the building's progress, and as you say, we can manage here for some time yet." "I'll think about it," said Mrs. Maughan cautiously. "Well, think quickly," adjured her husband. "There are other people interested in Tyler's Row." But his heart leapt nonetheless at this tiny chink in his wife's armor. Dare he hope? Much the same debate was going on at the Hales house. The comparative cheapness of the property appealed particularly to Peter, for schoolmasters are usually hard up, and this seemed to be a sound investment. "The site alone is worth the best part of the money," he told his wife. "Plots of land fetch astronomical prices now round here. We should get a good price for this place, and it would be comforting to have something in the bank. We'll be down to half our income when I retire. We must look ahead." "I know that," answered Diana unhappily, "but I really think that we shall find those two old things a terrible headache. If we could be sure they would be leaving soon. If nature takes its course properly, they'll be leaving in the next year or two. The old soldier is truly in the sere and yellow. I doubt if he'll last the winter." "Don't be so horribly calculating." "Who started it?" "I didn't mean so much by dying," began Diana, prevaricating. "Well, they're not likely to move out just to oblige us," said Peter flatly. "They're fixtures, all right, and we shall have to face the fact." "I hate being hustled," said Diana, changing her tactics. "Me too. I don't propose to leave this place until the next is habitable. That's understood. But if we made up our minds now, I could spend quite a bit of time during the summer holidays going over plans with the architect and doing a certain amount myself." "I do see that, but oh dear," sighed Diana. "Look at it this way," said Peter, pressing home the attack. "It's nearer the mark than anything else we've seen so far. We've always liked Fairacre. It's only 20 minutes from Caxley, and the site of the house is perfect. Faces south, just enough garden, endless possibilities with the whole row to consider." "You sound like Masters and Jones rolled into one. Are you sure you're not being too optimistic?" "Are you sure you're not being downright awkward?" retaliated Peter. "What in heaven's name, beside the two tenants, have you got against the place?" "It's dark, it's damp, it's falling down." "So was that mill house the Kings bought 10 years ago. When I went to see it with him, a mother rat the size of a rhino met us at the front door, with about 25 babies tagging along behind. Now it's superb and would sell for a bomb. Tyler's Row could be even better than that." "If we could be sure," said Diana slowly, "that the middle part would be absolutely ready to move into, and that there was some possibility of those two going in a reasonable time, so that we could incorporate their cottages eventually, then I think I'd agree." Her face lit up as an idea struck her. "Couldn't we offer them alternative accommodation? I'm sure I've heard something about it." They'd have to be willing to go, and you know what it's like finding something suitable. Still, I could find out about it. Give me until tomorrow to get used to the idea, said Diana. I think making decisions is the most exhausting thing in the world. You want practice, commented her husband dryly. She woke at 2 in the morning, the problem still unresolved. She had gone over the pros and cons so many times that her head buzzed. In the other bed, Peter snored rhythmically. Moonlight flooded the room, and an owl's cry wavered from the trees which edged the common some quarter of a mile away. Diana lay there, savoring the quietness. It would be quieter still at Fairacre, she supposed, remembering the vast sweep of downs behind the village. The remembrance of the neglected garden in the foreground flooded back to her, and she was shaken yet again by the longing to rescue it from decay. It could be so lovely in that setting, and the soil was rich, as the fine plants in the neighbors' gardens proved. Pinks should do well on that chalky soil, and lavender. A lavender hedge would grow easily. Her mind drifted, and then came back to Peter. It was only fair he should have his way in this matter. For years he had put up with Caxley for the sake of the family, always longing to settle eventually in the countryside nearby. This was their chance. Diana sighed and decided to creep downstairs to warm some milk. It might make her sleep. Experience told her that nothing short of clashing cymbals would stir Peter from his rest, but nevertheless she went on tiptoe from the room and went down the stairs. The moonlight was so bright that there was no need to switch on lights until she entered the kitchen. The cat gave a welcoming chirrup, stretched luxuriously, and descended from its bed on the kitchen chair near the stove. It watched Diana expectantly as she poured milk into a saucepan. A little snack in the middle of the night never came amiss. Diana shared the milk between her mug and the cat's saucer and stood warming her hands as she sipped. "How'd you like to live in the country, Puss?" asked Diana, watching the pink tongue at work. But the cat, strangely enough, never answered questions, and Diana carried her mug and her problems back to bed. "Go ahead," she said next morning when Peter awoke. "Go ahead where?" "With the house." "The Fairacre one?" "What else?" said Diana, slightly nettled. Peter never came to full consciousness until after breakfast. This morning he seemed more comatose than usual. "You're sure?" "No, I'm not, but I think we could make something of it, and if we're going to move, now's the right time." There was silence for a time, and then Diana heard humming from the other bed, proving that her husband was feeling contented. It was difficult to recognize the tune. It might have been "Onward, Christian Soldiers," "Take a Pair of Sparkling Eyes," roughly transposed for a tuneless baritone, or possibly the marching music from Dr. Zhivago. Peter's repertoire was limited, but gave him a great deal of private pleasure, and Diana a keen appreciation of variations on several themes. "Better get up then," said Peter, throwing aside the bedclothes. "I'll get down to Masters and Jones as soon as they open." Still humming, the Dr. Zhivago motif coming through strongly now, he made his way to the bathroom. And we will watch the gears of the real estate business continue to turn next time.